Hello and welcome to Motorsport and Performance. I'm Teddy, and in this video we are building a performance differential. Just a bit of background on the car we're working on. This is Michael's 15 to 17 Whipple Supercharged GT, which is about 950 brake horsepower. You've seen it before, most recently having its GT 350R brake kit. So without further ado, we're going to crack on and start stripping the car down. We need the exhaust off, the brakes off, the hubs off, and the prop so that we can remove the diff. So we've got the GoPro on my head today. This is a bit of a different style of video, but you're going to be able to see everything that I'm doing. And it is, you know, first person view. So we're starting by removing the vertical link. Now onto the camber arm, which is into the upper subframe. We've got a bolt on the outside that connects to the hub. We obviously need that off to remove the hub. And that's the camber arm off. I'm putting the nuts and bolts back in where they came from, just so it's nice and easy to put them back together. Now it's onto the steed adjustable toe link. That needs to come off, so allow us to swing down on the hub. You don't actually have to remove the hub, but I do anyway, just because it's out of the way. The last bolt for the hub, and that should just allow it to slide straight off that shaft. I've obviously give it a little tap with a rubber hammer just to free it up. Once that bolt comes out, that hub will come straight off. There we go, with a bit of a wiggle, we're free. I haven't removed the disc on this side. I didn't want to hit it too hard with a rubber mallet, but it would just caught on the drum brakes, remembering these are GT 350 upgraded brakes. Now I've already removed the half shafts. They were a bit of a struggle because the circlips on a GT 350, they are square, so it makes them quite the challenge to get out, but I took the camera off, focused, and got it straight out. And now, just the bolts for the diff that I've had to remove. There's only 4 of them. The prop's obviously being disconnected. We'll leave all the prop on the car, lower the diff, and wheel it out of the way. Now we've got the diff on the table, we can remove the rear plate cover. It requires a little tap with a hammer because there's a sealant seal on there, which we're obviously going to clean up shortly. I'm just having a look at the condition of the oil that's in there because this isn't a brand new diff. I think it's had a bit of hammer. Michael's been giving it some stick, so it's onto the cleaning process now. So I'm going to clean that rear housing up, all of it, front and rear, getting all the old oil out and all the rust off the back, because we're going to actually be painting this diff. We're going to go with a red back plate and a black housing. Whilst Charlie's cleaning that cover, I am now setting up the diff spreader. So if you try to remove one of these diffs at home, you're going to quickly find that it doesn't want to come out. The casing is actually clamping down pressure on the differential bearings. Now to do this we have to put what we call a spreader on. There is a special tool available, but we just made this one, and it works brilliantly. So we've got a big threaded rod through the middle, and we've wind the nuts out, adding pressure to force away that casing, and the diff will just pull out with a bit of luck. And we're removing the differential bearing caps, so these just pop off 215mm per side. I've actually engraved these so I know where they came from. The stock diff from Ford comes with a line drawn from the bearing to the housing, but what I find is I often rub them off when cleaning the diff out, so I just use a little engraver and write R and L on the bearing caps. Makes it really easy to see which side they came from. And then it's just pull the diff out, which is a little tricky with your fingers because it is a bit tight in there, but once you get the right position, it just slides straight out. Now Charlie's painting that rear cover, so we've taped off all the points where the bolts are going to seat, so we've got a fresh, clean mating surface, so we don't have any bolts backing off in future. We've gone with a nice bright red so it matches the GT350R brake calipers. Now it's removing the pinion. So to do that, the pinion and the pinion flange come apart. So we've removed the 29mm nut holding the pinion in place, and we just need to give it a good whack with an hammer and a fitting punch that fits inside the pinion end, and it'll just pop straight out. I like to leave a rag on the floor just to make sure any oil that's dripping down gets caught, and also it gives it a bit of a padded surface for the pinion to drop down onto. Not that the pinion's going to be used again, but just in case. Now I know there's going to be a lot of working on the floor in this video, but sometimes when you're working on something that moves around a lot like a diff and you need a lot of stability, you either need a really specialist stand for this, or just the floor's fine because the floor's not going anywhere. And now we can begin stripping the housing down. So that's the front pinion flange seal that's been removed. These are actually prone to leaking, and you do, to do the job right, have to do what I'm doing here. Obviously you don't need to paint it, but to get to this point with a crush washer, which we'll be talking about later, yes, the diff and the pinion need to come out to replace that seal. That's the bearing out for the pinion flange and the oil slinger, which we'll talk about later. And now it's onto the axle seals. So these are where the half shaft seal in. They are going to get replaced, never mind the bit of damage on them. Like I said, the GT350 half shafts were a bit of a pain to come out, but nevertheless with this getting a full rebuild, so we're not worried about them old seals. Just wiping some bits out there and inspecting stuff as I go, just to make sure that I'm not going to come across any nasty surprises when I start building it, but we're all looking good. Again, just having a good wipe down and inspecting the diff for any uneven wear, any damage or anything that's going to mess me up later in the job. So now we can carry on cleaning. I'm using a little polisher that just cleans up where the new seals are going to seat. Doing this now before the full clean, just so that it's done and dusted. Now what I'm doing is I am measuring the depth of the axle bearings. Now they do tend to be very, very similar. There is probably a couple of mil tolerance in it, but just measuring where it came from is really good, so you've got a reference from where to press them back in. Because there's no stop on these bearings, once we remove them they could go back in at any point along that chamfer. Now we're over at the press, we can press them bearings straight out and then move on to the racers. Now that's the axle bearings out, we can tap the racers out with a punch, one at the front for the pinion flange and one at the rear for the pinion bearing. Now Charlie's going to be cleaning up the housing, ready for painting. Now it's fully stripped, just so that any dust or dirt that gets inside this diff can be cleaned straight back out, and we've got a fresh, nice, clean diff to work with. While Charlie's underway with a big clean, I can now start assembling the new diff and the new pinion. So first things first, the pinion bearing spacer and the pinion bearing both need to be pressed onto the diff. So the pinion bearing spacer is a adjustment where we can move this pinion back or forth into the crown gear. So the larger pinion spacer is put on, the less backlash you're going to have, and the more you're going to move your gear contact up and away from the crown gear. Now that's all on, that is the pinion assembled. That is the pinion bearing race that will go on top of the pinion bearing. I'm just going to leave the bearing race on the pinion just so that I know where it is. Now we're going to be assembling the new diff with the new crown gear. So we've got loads of new parts here because we ordered a full rebuild kit. If the diff's done over a certain amount of mileage, we will order a full rebuild kit for it while we're here. So we've got some nice new bolts there. Just going to lay them out, get them all sorted and prepare the diff. So we're going to put this crown wheel straight over this diff. It just pops straight over and just take some time lining the holes up so you can start your bolts off by hand before you start the torquing procedure. Now that's the crown wheel on and I've torqued it up. That's a bit of a challenge when you don't have anything that can hold the diff and you can't do it in the car. I suppose you can, but it means taking the diff back out to carry on working on it. So now all that's left to do with this diff is put the new bearings on these sides. So these bearings are just press-on bearings. It may be worth noting to make sure that these are perfectly seated as with any bearing, but these more so because the diff is actually flush with the bearing and it needs an extra maybe 1/10 of a millimetre to drop it down onto its seat. And the other side, just making sure it's all nice and seated while it presses on. Now that's the pinion and the diff sorted, we can now start to rebuild the housing. So racers first, just showing how this goes in there. That's your bearing, and then you've not to forget the oil slinger. You don't actually get a new one of these oddly with the rebuild kit, but I suppose it's not a wearable part. Basically the oil comes up the front of the diff and that little washer just slings it around that bearing. Now these are a really tricky bearing to press in. If you don't get it right, it will cockle over. It's not got a tapered chamfer so that it fits. It does literally need to be perfect on its way in. So ensure extra care is taken when pressing one of these in. Now we can install the new seal. You don't need to put sealant on, but they don't come with sealant on from factory and they leak, and I've not had one leak after putting sealant on, so I'm just doing it for extra care and making sure the job doesn't return. And I'm using an old pinion bearing race because it's a perfect size to just tap that seal in nice and even and ensure it's sealed properly. When doing anything like this, I always use a nice small little toffee hammer. Just getting rid of that extra sealant there and making sure it's sealed nice and flush. And now it's the same for the axle bearings, so I'm just going to add a little bit of sealant just to ensure that these things never leak. So we're now at the stage where the diff has been refurbished. It's had all new seals, new bearings. We've even painted it just for customer preference. We also offer ceramic coating for this as well, which looks really cool. The diff and the gears are built up fully. All that's left to do is to put it together and let's do some testing. I'm turning the diff upside down and placing it on to the pinion flange, so I can align everything inside there, such as the oil slinger. That doesn't have a recessed hole, so it can fall into the middle, and if you can't see, it can be a little bit tricky to put the pinion in. Now that that's all aligned, I'm ready to place my new crush washer, which we'll talk about more soon, onto the pinion and pop the pinion in. Once that pinion's on its splines, I can then use a brass block and a little hammer to give it a good tap in, ensuring it's seated. This is just to get the thread out the other side so that I can put the nut on the top. Now I'm going to just gun it down a little bit. I think it'd be very hard done by to over torque this with a gun, because the torque that's required to tighten this is a massive amount. Now this is where the crush washer comes into its own. Your crush washer crushes up as you tighten that nut. Now you don't torque this nut down, what you do is you tighten it and then measure the turning resistance with an old style torque wrench. It's really hard to capture it on camera, it's really hard to see with your eyes as it's moving all the time, but this was perfect. As with the pinion bearing spacer, we also have diff bearing spacers. Now in this particular diff, I use the ones that came out. You do get shims if you need to adjust, but I find that 9 times out of 10, this diff goes straight in and has the perfect gear contact and perfect backlash with the OEM shims. So we're using our spreader again. We're going to just drop that diff in nice. It takes a look, you can see how tight it is, and I'm just going to wiggle it in a little bit and it just all of a sudden drops in. And now we're going to reinstall the caps. Obviously they've been cleaned, ensuring I'm putting them in the same way they came out with my markings. And I'm going to torque them down to a first stage 50 foot-pound, and then I'm going to remove the diff spreader and torque them down properly. As you can see here, I'm doing the final torque and I've removed the bars so there's no pressure spreading the diff. And that's the diff built. All that's left to do now is check the backlash and then check the gear contact. So with the backlash, I've got a tolerance from 0.008 to 0.012, and this one came out perfect at 0.010. Now I've put the gear contact paste on, what I'm going to do is add resistance to the diff by holding it and then turning over that pinion bearing. I'm going to go forwards and backwards so I can check the contact on the heel and on the toe, and I'm also looking for any riding up on the teeth. So this actually has a perfect gear contact as always with our builds, and it's dead centre and not riding up on the teeth. Now that's the diff all painted and ready to go back together. I just need to clean that gear paste off and then start adding the sealant for the rear plate. Now that's my icing skills put to the test, I can put the rear diff cover on. And now we're back onto the install. So I'm just going to get the jack stand ready. Saves lifting and messing around with the diff because it is a bit tight to put into that rear subframe. This just makes the whole job a hell of a lot easier. Now this diff's been painted, so obviously I need to take extra care putting it in, make sure it goes straight in and doesn't damage all the hard work Charlie's carried out. So now that's the diff all in place, I just need to install the bolts, torque them down, and then I can build the car back up the same way it came apart. I'm also going to install some brand new differential oil, which is actually upgraded for this torsen differential. And that's a wrap for this video, guys. The diff's all built, it's all installed. We've actually done a wheel alignment on the car as well, which you haven't seen, but the back end's been all apart, so it's standard procedure to do a wheel alignment. Now, that is it for this video. We're actually going to get Michael back on the channel, and he's going to take you guys out on a test drive with him to see his reaction to what he thinks to the new diff. Let us know what you think to this style of video. Thank you guys for watching. We'll see you next time.